Hello, I'm here in my little arts and crafts corner today to share with you some reflections I've had on my previous video. That was on autism, ADHD and masking, and I thought at the time of people pleasing and masking, or masking and neurodivergence in particular, as very much linked, that if we mask because we don't want to come across as awkward or difficult, and we find ways to fit in, be more acceptable, I guess, to others, then that counts as people pleasing. But today I've actually listened to a podcast by one of my favourite YouTubers, Orion, this autistic guy, and a lot became clearer for me. Now, Orion mentioned that masking is actually a kind, or rather people pleasing, he was talking about, is actually a form of a stress response, a trauma response. If you think about fight, flight, freeze and fawn, not everybody perhaps has heard of the fourth trauma response of fawn, but it's basically if we can't fight our way out of a threat, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger back in the day of our biological ancestors, or we can't run away. And today's threats are often people and fitting in and not fitting in and survival and being part of a tribe, really. So if we don't fit in, it feels very much like a survival threat. So if we can't fight, flight, freeze, we fawn. And fawn very much comes under people pleasing. That was my little light bulb moment today, that when I've spent a lot of my time in my life working out how to communicate, how to speak well, how to listen, how to talk to people and make them feel comfortable. But what I've been thinking about now is how that's very much not sustainable, because it is at my own expense. So following on from my last video, my thoughts really around bumping into a neighbour when I don't want to bump into a neighbour was the example of how to deal with that. And so often I can overcomplicate things, and I can think to myself, oh, I don't want to appear rude, so I can't, it flitted through my mind, I should just say, oh, I'm busy, and keep walking. But I didn't want to do that. I'd come across as rude, and I also didn't want to get drawn into a conversation explaining what I was doing. And because I had my phone and I had a new selfie stick because I was out practicing, because I'm new to all of this, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and it just put me on the spot. Suddenly there she was coming towards me, and I kind of wanted to hide, I guess. It was the flight aspect of that's why I walked away, because I didn't want to be rude, but I also did not want to open up questions and explanations. And so often I overtalk, overshare, over-explain, which I think all comes back to, I'm not even going to call it people pleasing anymore, people appeasing and fawning as a way to be acceptable and a non-threat and liked and generally approved of. And I'm sure it all goes back as well. If you look in your own life, you might have similar examples where it's often relatives. I think my grandmother in particular encouraged the sociability and being able to talk and communicate and look after the elder relatives, that type of thing. And for me, the other side of that, although I became a fawner, I realise now I would never have admitted that, because my other more instinctive trauma or stress response is fight. I tend to always feel I need to stand up for myself, not to physically fight, but to verbally speak up for myself and not back down and back in the day, I used to argue and, all sorts, get into all sorts of screaming matches, no doubt, and things that, yes, I've learned to manage it better, but it really was quite a rage response at times where I had felt misunderstood and that people are not listening and they don't understand me, and I really, really wanted to put across myself. So I think in a way it was about having my own autonomy and also authenticity, that if I'd only been fawning, I might not have even been aware of my needs in such an obvious way, but I was very aware. But the trouble with that was I was in this constant battle and conflict between putting across my needs in a way that possibly came across as rude and, dare I say, aggressive, even though it felt it was actually defensive when people weren't understanding me, and fawning and being polite. And in certain situations I can only be polite, I can't be that rude. Let's think of work, for example. So this, I think it's the internal conflict is the main problem, because I hadn't learned how to confidently and politely draw a boundary. So just carrying on walking and ending a conversation, that's another thing I find hard. If I'm talking to someone, I don't want to be rude and cut them off. And sometimes I'm the one that I think ends up talking too much, and no doubt they want to get away, but I don't want to stop talking, or don't know how to. I don't know quite how to stop. So that's a momentum issue. So there's so many sort of complications with this, but I do think that people appeasing and masking, and the conflict between how do we put across what we need in a way that is going to be acceptable and not pushed back on, because so often if I'd explain I didn't want to do something, there would be criticism, or there would be guilt tripping, or there would be, in various relationships, undermining of my position, and so that I ended up changing and my decision not to do something. Usually it was a not to do something, and doing it, and then building up a lot of resentment about that. So it makes so much sense, I suppose, to me to think of this as a trauma response, in order to then think, okay, so what do we do about it now? So I have 3 tips or 3 thoughts on how to manage our people-pleasing, people-appeasing, masking behaviour. The first one is firstly just to notice it, to acknowledge it, to recognise where it originated, how we came to need to behave in ways that weren't natural to us in order to survive in our early life, really, and work out ways to belong. The second tip from that understanding would be also to manage any self-criticism and try to be kinder to ourselves. I always come back to this because I've had such a strong internal critic. Rather than the self-blame and shame, let's just acknowledge, okay, it was a survival tactic. What could little me have done differently if I fought and argued and screamed and said, this isn't for me? That wouldn't have gone down well, and it didn't. I did do that. If I froze, or I ran, or I walked away, I didn't really do that so much. But the fawning, the putting on a mask, behaving well, being sociable and polite, I definitely did. So I have to give myself some grace and say, well, I understand why I did that. And I actually used to, still feel it's been a skill that I've really developed over my life to be able to communicate and make people feel comfortable, and that's not a bad thing, but it can be if it's at my expense. And so the third tip would be just to have a kind of script and maybe a prop with you if it's about being out in the world and I might meet somebody I don't really want to whole conversation, rather than either avoiding going out in the first place or thinking, oh no, what do I do if somebody's walking towards me? Just be more prepared that this is going to happen, and it's either the momentum to keep going and keep walking and say, hello, yes, I'm off here, if you are indeed off here, but not to worry and not to take on the worry of you might have upset them. That's the other thing. It's not our responsibility to manage other people's emotions. As long as we're polite, we don't owe people anything. That's a really big part of this. I think we feel sometimes that we owe them a lot more than we actually do. And just to acknowledge and be polite to them, that is more than enough. So have a have a prop as well. Could be, like your headphones, could be like a phone. Oh, I'm just going on a work call or something like that. That's what I could have actually said. I think that actually leads me to another point as I digress of why I, and maybe this is a neurodivergent characteristic, why I find it really difficult, because I'm not good at lying. Some neurodivergent people are very good at lying, I know, but quite often we're not, and we are honest. And again, it can be at our own expense, because I don't even like a white lie, really, to say, oh, I'm going on a call, when I'm not going on a call. I always felt I owed people the truth. It's crazy, isn't it? Because I don't owe people anything in that respect. But I don't like lying. So I just have to come up with a phrase, perhaps. And maybe it's worth thinking about it, as I say beforehand, of yes, I'm doing this, and keep on walking. Or if you're a sitting target, because that's the other thing, people come up to you if you might be reading, you might be on your phone. And normally I would get involved in a conversation. I have to find a way, and this is something I'm still working on, but I find a polite way to shut it down. And obviously if it doesn't shut down, then it might be, I need to stand up and say, right, I've got to go now, and politely exit. But this is obviously an ongoing theme for me, an ongoing issue that I need to keep working on, because it's not sustainable if I'm going into a stress or trauma response which makes my heart race, which puts my blood pressure up, by not being able to actively fight or flight and go. I have to be in a situation. This is where the fawning part comes in and the conflict comes in, and there's such then a huge impact on physical health, let alone mental health, because you're in conflict with yourself, and it does increase blood pressure, and it does and inflammation, and certainly your mental health, things like anxiety, it does increase all of these things. So the more we can acknowledge it, that it is again likely to happen, but we can have strategies. We can work out before we're in a situation that it's okay. We don't owe people. We won't be unkind, won't be impolite, but we can say, this is this, and then we can stop a conversation or have a boundary and move on. So I hope that's been a bit helpful today. It's a few of my thoughts, and any questions, obviously do leave them, any reflections that you have, and I'll see you in the next one.